I am sending this account because I was never able to officially prove what happened during that shift, but I also never managed to forget the numbers I saw on that scale. I've been driving for 15 years and have faced everything on the road, but I've never had a problem with sealed cargo that I couldn't explain technically. If you publish real stories from truck drivers, perhaps this will serve as a warning to those who place too much trust in security seals and automated systems. It all started with a ticket from CatScale indicating a weight that did not match the manifest. And 400 extra pounds inside a sealed trailer simply shouldn't exist. My name is Daniel Harper, and I primarily travel between Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee, transporting medical and industrial cargo on a weekly basis. I picked up this shipment at a fully automated warehouse in rural Ohio, where I didn't see a single employee throughout the entire process. The digital manifest clearly indicated medical supplies with a declared weight of exactly 12,000 pounds with no additional margin. The seal was applied by a robotic arm, and the system digitally confirmed that the rear doors had closed. There was no human conference, no eye contact, and no one to question any detail. At the first stop at CatScale, I followed the standard weighing procedure before continuing my longer interstate trip. The ticket showed a combined axle load of 12,400 pounds for the trailer, a figure that was not within the acceptable tolerance. It wasn't a minimal difference due to redistribution or a miscalculation between axles. It was a genuine excess of total gross weight. 400 pounds may not appear due to vibration, pallet shift, or quick reading failure. 400 pounds is roughly equivalent to the weight of 2 adult men. I went down to personally check the seal before jumping to any conclusions about a technical error with the scale. The seal was intact, with no scratch marks, no partial cuts, and no visible signs of replacement. The trailer's temperature system indicated complete stability, with no active alert at that time. I considered the possibility of a scale error and returned for a second weighing a few minutes later. The second ticket confirmed exactly the same number of additional weights. I continued my journey trying to convince myself that it could be a reading error or a minimal variation in the palletized load inside the refrigerated trailer. The cooling system was stable, and the smart sensor app showed a constant temperature without any suspicious fluctuations. Around 2 in the morning, I received an unusual notification on my cell phone connected to the internal sensor of the trunk. The alert indicated high CO2 levels detected in the sealed interior of the trailer during the early morning hours. I had never received this type of warning before when transporting only gauze, syringes, and packaged medical supplies. At first I thought it might be a sensor malfunction or electronic interference caused by prolonged road vibration. The trailer was not transporting organic products or chemical materials that could generate a significant accumulation of carbon dioxide. The system showed a gradual and steady increase in internal concentration over 30 minutes. It wasn't an instantaneous spike like a reading error. It was a consistent consumption and production curve. This meant that something was altering the composition of the air inside a sealed space. I reviewed the technical manual within the app itself while driving, trying to find a plausible explanation for that pattern. Elevated CO2 levels in an enclosed environment are typically associated with human or animal respiration in a restricted volume. There was no indication of a failure in the sealing system, nor any temperature variation that would justify fermentation or a chemical reaction. The cargo was inert and properly packaged in sealed boxes with no active biological component. The only common factor in any similar reading is the presence of organic matter consuming oxygen. What bothered me most was that the increase wasn't abrupt. It was progressive and regular, as if following a physiological rhythm. I didn't hear any noise coming from the trailer while I was driving on the interstate that morning. There was also no noticeable change in vehicle stability or internal cargo movement, but the app kept sending notifications of higher than normal concentration levels, even in empty environments. And the metal seal was still intact on the back of the trunk. Around 3 in the morning, I could no longer ignore the notifications that kept arriving on my cell phone. The CO2 level was not dropping even with the cooling system functioning normally. I slowed down and pulled over to the dark shoulder of a quiet stretch of road in Pennsylvania. It wasn't the ideal place to stop, but I needed to understand if it was a technical error or something bigger. I turned off the engine and the silence of the road became too heavy. I got out of the cab and walked to the back of the trailer with my cell phone flashlight on. The metal seal was intact, without twisting, scratches, or any visible signs of tampering. I ran my hand along the aluminum frame, looking for abnormal vibrations or hotspots. There was no noticeable load shift nor any unusual smell coming from the seal. Everything seemed completely sealed and under control. I pressed my ear against the side of the trunk, trying to pick up any unusual internal noises. The metal was cold and transmitted only the distant echo of trucks passing on the interstate. I didn't hear any clear banging, shouting, or obvious sounds of sudden movement. But there was an almost imperceptible variation in internal pressure detected by the sensor. It was as if the air inside was changing without me being able to hear the reason. The worst part was realizing that opening the seal myself could put me in an impossible position. If there was anything illegal inside, I would become responsible for tampering with sealed cargo. If there were nothing else, I would be breaking protocol based solely on technical data. I stood there for minutes that felt longer than any drive. The app kept showing CO2 levels above normal in an environment that should have been empty. I went back to the cabin and stood there for a few minutes staring at the dashboard without starting the engine again. The sensor continued to register high levels of CO2, and the curve showed no downward trend. I knew that this wasn't normal for a shipment consisting solely of packaged medical supplies. At the same time, there was no visible evidence of tampering with the trailer's metal seal. It was like being faced with a technical problem that had no acceptable logical explanation. I considered continuing my journey to the next official checkpoint and temporarily ignoring the app's alert. I also thought about breaking the seal right there and opening the trunk to eliminate any immediate doubt. But opening a sealed trailer without formal authorization can end a driver's career. I had no concrete proof other than a sensor and an excess weight registered on the scale. Even so, something didn't add up in that equation. That's when I decided to call the state police and report exactly what was happening. I explained about the excess of 400 pounds on the CAT scale and about the elevated CO2 levels in the app. I made it clear that the seal was intact and that I hadn't opened the trailer since I picked it up. They instructed me to proceed to a monitored inspection point where they could watch the official opening. I went back to driving with a heavy stomach and my phone in hand, monitoring every change. During the journey to the indicated point, the CO2 level began to fluctuate slightly before gradually decreasing. The fall wasn't instantaneous. It was slow and gradual, as if something had been interrupted. I didn't pull over to the side of the road again, and I didn't see any suspicious vehicles approaching the trailer. When I arrived at the agreed location, the seal was still intact and showed no signs of tampering. But the app no longer showed any abnormally high concentrations. When the police arrived and authorized the official opening of the trailer, I stood to the side observing every move. The seal was cut under registration, and the rear doors were opened with a body camera recording everything. The boxes of medical supplies were organized exactly as they were during automated loading. There was no one inside the main compartment, and there was no obvious sign of internal tampering. At first glance, it seemed that the entire warning had been a baseless technical error. But the excess weight registered on the scale still needed a concrete explanation. One of the agents requested a more detailed inspection of the trailer's floor and undercarriage. That's when they identified an area with recent welding beneath the main layer of aluminum. The screws appeared to be a structural part, but some had a different finish than the rest. Upon removing the bottom panel, they revealed a hidden compartment beneath the floor. The space was narrow, lined internally with insulating material and thin lead plates. There were small ventilation holes disguised among almost imperceptible external rivets. The interior was empty at the time but showed recent signs of use and human contact. There were no personal belongings, no identification, and no direct evidence of who had been there. This space is designed for clandestine transport without touching the main cargo. The most unsettling thing was realizing that that compartment could not have been accessed from inside the trunk. It opened from the bottom, from the outside, without needing to break the rear seal of the trailer. This means that someone could have used my truck for transportation without my knowledge. During the early morning hours while I was driving or sleeping at a previous gas station, they could have opened it from underneath. I never saw the faces of those who were there, nor of those who removed them before the inspection. If you're into real road stories like this, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. It really helps the channel grow and pushes these stories out to more people. I'm writing this because I still haven't been able to explain to myself what happened that night after I got back from the route. I found a key inside my truck 2 hours after parking in the company lot. It's not my key, it doesn't belong to the company, and it doesn't belong to anyone I know or have given a ride to. I haven't been inside my own house in 3 weeks because I've been driving straight down I-40 without a long break. Even so, someone left a key inside my cabin while I was on the road. I found it secured to the driver's seat rail, in a spot where nothing falls due to accidents or highway vibrations. It wasn't lying on the floor, nor was it obviously hidden. It was positioned precisely and silently. It seemed to have been placed there on purpose, as if the person knew I would eventually find it sooner or later. The key was clean, with no accumulated dust, no old marks of use, and no corrosion on the metal edges. It didn't look like something that had been forgotten under the bench for days or weeks. I always lock the cabin when I get out to refuel or use the restroom, especially at isolated gas stations in New Mexico. I don't give rides, I don't let strangers get on my bike, and I don't usually open doors unnecessarily in open areas. I mentally reviewed every stop from the last 48 hours, trying to remember any truly vulnerable moment. I found no reason why someone would enter without me noticing any unusual movement or noise. Even so, the key was there as physical proof that something had happened. What bothered me most wasn't the key itself, but the certainty that someone was inside my personal space. To put that thing there, it wasn't enough to just open the door and run out before I got back from the gas station. The person had to lean over, adjust the track, and position the key at a specific point on the seat. This requires time, silence, and the confidence that I wouldn't return at that moment. And I have no idea when that happened. After I found the key, the first thing I did was review the recordings from the internal camera I use for security. It records continuously while the truck is running and continues for several minutes, even after the engine is turned off. I almost never watch those images because they usually show nothing but me going in and out. That night I sat in the booth and began to go through the files with unusual attention. That's when I realized there was a gap of a few minutes that I didn't clearly remember. At one of the stops at a secluded gas station in New Mexico, I left the truck to use the restroom quickly. The recording shows the cabin empty, the interior light off, and only the panel flashing in standby mode. Nothing happens in the first few seconds apart from the slight vibration caused by trucks passing on the highway. After almost 2 minutes, the CB radio changes frequency on its own, with a clear pop in the audio. I didn't turn on the radio before leaving, and I don't usually leave it tuned to that frequency. I kept watching and noticed a detail that made me pause the video several times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. The sleeper curtain, which I always leave fastened to the side, moved a few millimeters forward. It wasn't a strong jolt. It wasn't wind coming in through the window. It was a minimal and continuous movement. There were no open windows and no doors were registered as unlocked in the truck's system. Even so, something inside the cabin had moved while I was away. The strangest thing is that when I returned to the truck that night, I didn't notice anything out of place. I got in, sat down, and continued my journey as I do at all quick stops. If anyone was there, they managed to leave before I returned and without making a noticeable sound. I watched that recording 3 times in a row trying to find a simple explanation. So far, I haven't found one that reassures me. The following night, I was already paying attention to any unusual details inside the cabin. I left the CB radio on at a low frequency, just to monitor common road noises. Around 2 in the morning, while crossing an empty stretch of I-40, I heard my call sign being called. It wasn't a loud or aggressive voice. It was a calm and controlled tone, almost too polite. The person described the color of my jacket and mentioned the sticker on my dashboard. I immediately looked in the mirrors, hoping to see a nearby truck keeping pace with me. The highway was virtually empty, with no headlights visible for miles behind or ahead. The voice continued speaking as if it were observing the cabin from the inside. He mentioned the thermal mug to the right of the steering wheel and the faint blue light on my dashboard. I didn't answer and turned off the radio, but the feeling had already set in. I drove for a few minutes in absolute silence, trying to rationalize what I had heard. Perhaps someone had passed by me before and quickly memorized the details. Perhaps it was closer than I could see in the darkness of the highway. But the description was too accurate to be a quick guess or a random assumption. It sounded like someone who had been inside the truck. What disturbed me most was the tone of his voice, which carried neither urgency nor explicit threat. There was no request to stop, no attempt to block or physically approach. It was simply a calm observation, as if reading a list that was already familiar. This didn't seem improvised. It seemed like a continuation of something that had started before. It was at that moment that I stopped doubting that someone was involved. After the call on the radio, I stopped at a mandatory weigh station near the state border. While waiting for clearance, I decided to look for anything out of place inside the cabin. I was no longer trying to calm myself down, I was trying to confirm what I suspected. I started with the sleeper, lifting the mattress, checking the compartments and side panels. That's when I found something that shouldn't be there. Behind the lower right-hand panel, there was a space that was not part of the original structure. The lid wasn't broken, but it appeared to have been carefully removed and replaced. Upon opening it, I found remnants of recently eaten food packaging and a small bottle of water. Nothing was old or dried out, indicating recent use within that space. Someone had stayed there long enough to consume something. At the bottom of the compartment was a folded map of my hometown with a circle marked on it. The circle wasn't at the company or any delivery point. It was on the street where my house is located. I never leave personal documents in the truck that indicate my exact address. This meant that the person already had this information before entering the room. The key I found the day before started to make more sense at that moment. I didn't find anyone there when I did the inspection, but I did find recent presence. The space was cramped, but someone thin could remain hidden for hours without being noticed. The slightest movement of the curtain that I saw in the recording began to fit with that. The radio call ceased to be a random provocation and became a logical continuation. Someone was inside my truck while I was driving. After I found the compartment, I didn't continue the trip normally as if nothing had happened. I parked in a well-lit area, called the local police, and waited inside the cabin with the doors locked. I explained everything objectively, without exaggerating or dramatizing the details of what I had seen. The officers arrived about 40 minutes later and conducted a thorough inspection of the vehicle. They confirmed that the panel had been removed recently. They didn't find anyone in the truck, but they confirmed that the space could accommodate a thin person. They collected the key I had kept and gathered up the remaining packaging and the water bottle. One of the officers commented that they had seen similar cases on long interstate routes. According to him, the intruder enters when the driver stops in isolated locations and exits at a prearranged point. This would explain how no one was found inside the truck at that time. I asked if they had any concrete clues as to who it might be or exactly how they operated. They said that many use support trucks or unmarked vehicles to monitor the route. The radio call could have been made by someone at a distance with information passed on by an accomplice. None of this sounded improvised to them. It sounded like a method repeated in more than one state. Even so, no suspect had been identified in that specific incident. They filed the report, recommended a complete review of the locking system, and released me. There was no evidence of a crime in progress, no arrest, and no confirmation of the intruder's identity. They said he probably left the truck at some earlier rest stop during the early morning hours. The problem is that nobody could say exactly when or where this happened, and that means he left when he wanted to. After registering, I didn't sleep in the truck again that night. I stopped at a simple hotel on the side of the highway and asked for a room on the second floor. I put my suitcase through the makeshift scanner in the lobby as if I were exaggerating. I locked the door twice and placed the chair against the doorknob just to be safe. Even so, the silence of the room seemed different from the silence of the road. I sat on the bed staring at the door for too long before turning off the light. With every noise in the hallway, my body reacted as if someone were testing the lock. I knew that rationally, no one could have known where I was at that moment. But I also figured that nobody could get into my truck without me noticing. This logic had already failed once. Police said he likely exited through the external tool compartment in Oklahoma. They found no usable fingerprints, and could not locate the possible support vehicle. The incident was recorded as an unidentified intrusion with no confirmed suspect. This means that officially the case is open, but stalled. In practice, this means he's still around. I'm sending this because if you drive a white Volvo and frequently stop on I-40, especially on the stretch between New Mexico and Oklahoma, check your sleeper now. Check the seat rail, inspect the lower panels, and don't ignore any frequency changes on the radio. I didn't see anyone inside my truck while I was driving, but someone was there. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 38 years old, and I have been driving on the highways of the Midwest for almost 15 years straight. I've done long shifts crossing Kansas, Nebraska, and Tennessee more times than I can remember. That day was just another 12-hour shift, or at least that's what I thought when I left home. I did my full pre-trip check, inspecting tires, brakes, air pressure, and lights, just like I do every morning. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when I left the yard with the newly sealed cargo. The collection took place in the late afternoon, in an industrial warehouse that was far too clean for that isolated area. The shipping cost was slightly above average, but still within what I would consider normal for that route. I signed the manifesto, witnessed the application of the seal, and confirmed the number twice as a matter of professional habit. The process was quick, quiet, and without unnecessary conversation between me and the loading team. They seemed interested only in the trailer, not in me. What bothered me afterward was realizing that almost no one there made direct eye contact with me. They didn't ask about my route, rest periods, or planned stops. They only confirmed the trunk's number one more time before closing the doors with excessive caution. It was a technical look, as if they were evaluating something specific in the trailer's structure. At that moment, I considered it to be just a well-executed protocol. While waiting for clearance to leave, I noticed a dark SUV parked on the other side of the yard. He wasn't close enough to appear to be part of the loading operation at that warehouse. He also didn't look like an ordinary visitor or a driver waiting their turn at the dock. The engine was running and the headlights were off, as if it were simply observing the movement. I ignored him and left as soon as they opened the gate, never imagining I would see him again. The first few hours on the road were far too quiet for the start of a long shift. Traffic was light and night began to fall without any sudden changes to the route. I went through the first active scale and was released without any questions. The strange thing was that the truck in front of me stopped, but I didn't. This doesn't normally bother me, but that night it stuck in my head. Almost 40 minutes later, I saw the same dark SUV on the side of the highway. He was stopped with his hazard lights on, but no one seemed to be around the vehicle. When I passed by, I noticed that the engine was still running, even though there were no visible signs of a problem. It wasn't a clear case of a breakdown. There was no open hood or warning triangle on the track. It was simply a presence stationed at the exact spot where I needed to pass. I slowed down by 5 miles per hour for no apparent reason, just to observe myself in the mirror. The SUV re-entered the lane a few minutes later, maintaining a constant distance. He neither accelerated to overtake, nor got close enough to put pressure on the opponent. The distance was too precise, as if someone were measuring the interval. It didn't seem like persecution, it seemed like monitoring. I decided to slightly change lanes and test the reaction of the vehicle behind me. The SUV also shifted, maintaining the same side alignment for a few seconds. It was a small adjustment, almost imperceptible to those who aren't paying attention. But for someone who's been driving for 15 years, small adjustments tell stories. And that story was only just beginning. After nearly 6 hours of driving, I began to realize that the discomfort wasn't just coming from the SUV. The same model of truck I was driving appeared in my rearview mirror a few miles past the second active weigh station. It was the same color, same cab configuration, and even the same side markers mounted on the bumper. This isn't common, but it's not impossible on Midwestern highways either. What made it strange was how it maintained the exact same pace as me for far too long. I slowed down again to test the behavior, something I do when I feel someone is adjusting their travel time to mine. The truck behind slowed down by the same amount, maintaining a constant distance without overtaking or backing up. There was no attempt at radio communication, no flashing of high beams to request passage. It was absolute silence, as if we were both waiting for something to happen. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more coordinated it seemed. I drove through a construction zone where the road narrowed and the speed limit dropped abruptly. Normally, trucks reorganize in these areas, some accelerating as they exit the zone to make up time. The truck behind me did exactly what I did, without anticipating or delaying any movement. That synchronicity ceased to seem like coincidence and began to seem like rehearsal. I had no proof of anything, but I had repetition. That's when I started to realize that the SUV and the twin truck never appeared at the same spot at the same time. When one was visible, the other would disappear for a few minutes. This alternation wasn't constant, but it was enough to seem organized. There was no timing error, no aggressive approach, just alternating presence. An alternating presence requires communication between more than one person. By the 8th hour of my shift, I was no longer trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. The SUV reappeared in a rest area I don't usually use. I pulled in just to test if the pattern would continue, with no real need to stop. I stayed inside the cabin, observing through the mirrors before turning off the engine. A few minutes later, I saw familiar headlights slowly entering through the side access. The SUV didn't park close to me, but it also wasn't far enough away to seem casual. It stopped in a spot where I could see both the exit and the line of trucks. The engine remained running and no one got out the entire time I was there. There was no attempt to approach, no direct interaction. It was just a silent presence, as in the previous hours. I decided to leave earlier than usual and get back on the road without taking the full break. When I got back on the highway, I didn't see the SUV immediately behind me. For a few minutes, the road was completely empty in the rearview mirror. This momentary absence almost brought me relief, but the relief was short-lived. About 20 minutes later, the truck identical to mine reappeared in the rearview mirror, maintaining the same precise distance as before. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't running late, just aligned with my pace. There was no attempt to overtake, even with a clear road for long stretches. It was at that moment that I understood that this wasn't improvisation. It was patient coordination. By the 10th hour of my shift, I was no longer just driving routinely. I was driving to test my limits. Normally, I always stop at the same spot when the clock approaches that time. It's a large, well-lit rest area with visible cameras, and any driver who takes that route knows it. That night, I decided to completely ignore that pattern. I drove straight past the exit without slowing down, and continued for more miles than my body considered comfortable. I looked in the mirror expecting an immediate reaction, but nothing happened in the first few minutes. The SUV didn't appear, and the twin truck wasn't visible right behind it either. The road seemed too clean, too empty for that particular stretch. This sudden absence was almost more unsettling than the constant presence of the previous hours. Because absence is also a strategy. I slowed down slightly again to see if anything would appear in the distance. After a few minutes, I saw lights appear on the horizon, but I couldn't clearly identify the vehicle. They kept a sufficient distance so it didn't seem like a direct pursuit. There was no aggressive approach or attempt to overtake. It was as if they were waiting for me to choose where to sleep. That's when I decided to drive an extra 40 minutes beyond my usual pace and stop at a spot I rarely use. It wasn't the most comfortable place, but it was unpredictable within my own routine. I needed to know if it was about that night or about my pattern of behavior. The only way to find out was to completely break the sequence that someone seemed to be observing. As the 12th hour approached, I was already well past the point where I would normally have ended my shift. My body was beginning to feel the fatigue, but my mind was more alert than usual. I chose a small, quiet gas station, far from the places I usually use on this route. I parked slowly, keeping the engine running for a few minutes before turning it off. I observed every reflection in the mirrors before making any decision. I waited to see if the SUV would appear or if the twin truck would pull up right after me. Neither showed up in the first 10 minutes. The line of trucks remained still, with no suspicious movement or familiar lights approaching. The highway alongside was silent, with sporadic and distant traffic. For the first time that night, I was truly alone. And that's exactly what bothered me, because if they were following me to take action, they gave up too quickly after I broke the pattern. And if they weren't trying to take action that night, then they were just gathering information. Observing where I usually stop, how long I take between scales, how I adjust my speed. It stopped being stalking and became mapping. The next day, I delivered the cargo without any problems, and nobody mentioned anything out of the ordinary. No approaches, no irregularities, no direct confrontation occurred. But to this day, I don't know if I was discarded as a target or if I continue to be part of a pattern that I never fully understood. Sometimes what's most frightening isn't what happens, but what almost happened. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful or engaging, consider subscribing to follow the next journeys. Until next time, and drive safe.